Hi, this is Russ Anderson. This tutorial is going to give you an introduction to supervised tracking, which is used in more complicated situations where the automatic tracker isn't able to do its thing. So supervised tracking involves you, the supervisor, operating the tracking tools in SynthEyes. It's you who's the supervisor. And to do that, you need to know how to adjust all the different controls. And there are many within SynthEyes for supervised tracking. So this is going to give you an introduction to them, give you some idea of where to look under particular situations. You might want to go and follow up on some of these things in more detail in the manual or in some of the additional tutorials that cover more specific features in detail. So you don't have to use all of these features all the time on any individual track. We're just trying to give you an idea of what's there and what the situation is for starters. You might also consider whether you want to use the planar tracker in some situations as well, but that again is a separate area. So for starters, here's our shot. We've got a whole bunch of stuff moving around. We're going to start off with a fairly simple tracker on the bark of this foreground tree. So the fastest way to start tracking with the supervised tracker is just to hold down the C key on the keyboard, and while you're doing that, push the left mouse button. You notice that drops you over to the tracking room. If we wanted to do this directly without that particular trick, we'd go to the trackers room and then turn on the creation wand, and then we could go and create the trackers. But the C key is a faster and easier way to do that. A lot of people don't know since it's there's no user interface for it. Now, once you've created a tracker, you always want to set up the parameters for it appropriately. A lot of times people have supervised tracking problems, and you look at what they've done, and everything's at the default settings, and that's just not the way to go. So the first important decision to look at is what mode SynthEyes should use to look for the pattern in the next frame. And there are two main modes depending on what kind of shot you have. There's the steady camera mode that's for things like shots on dollies and tripods and whatnot, where there's a relatively smooth motion and everything keeps going pretty much in the same direction. Then there's handheld mode for situations where the camera is bouncing around a lot and you can't really predict what's going to happen next based on what the last couple of frames has been. And there may well be a gray zone on that. It's an artistic decision that you need to make depending on the particular shot. Here we're going to start out with the smooth mode, even though it's really a handheld shot. It's particularly the case because we've got something that's moving fairly rapidly and effectively smoother than it might otherwise seem. Now the next thing that we need to adjust is the size of the tracker. And there are some trade-offs here. If we make the tracker size too small, then you're going to get duplications. It's like if you have repeated texture on a whole bunch of windows in a row, you could get, this window or that window, or a lot of the leaves here, for example. So that same thing happens even in other situations, that the smaller the pattern is, the odds are higher that something else is going to look just like it. But if you make the pattern too big, then you start picking up too much other stuff, and the changes in that will throw off your track. So it's a balance between the two. And also, the larger the pattern, the more perspective shifts there'll be during the shot based on the movement of the camera relative to the feature. So it's a trade-off and an artistic decision you need to make. Next, you need to pick the size of the search region. And here we know that the thing is going to be moving to the left. So we'll go with a larger horizontal search size. And with those things set up, and I'll point out, we also have a bunch of different tracker types as well. Most of the time with supervised tracking, you'll be using the normal pattern matcher mode that we're in, but there are also spots that are optimized just for bright spots, dark spots, for things that are symmetric as well. So to move through the shot, we have a couple different ways. One is the middle mouse button, the little scroll wheel, and you can do that either in the mini tracker view or down here in the time bar. You can also use the period to move forward and the comma to go back, or the S and D keys on the keyboard as well. And I'll point out SynthEyes is set up so the keyboard accelerators can be used to do the supervised tracking basically completely without using the mouse at all. And as we move forward in the shot, SynthEyes is doing the tracking. And I'll point out if you move backwards, then it's not doing any tracking. It's just giving you what it has before. So we move forward. You see that SynthEyes is locked onto that feature, and the feature itself is pretty well centered in the search box. So it's able to predict where the thing is going, and that says that, well, we can really make the search box smaller since we know pretty much where it's going. And that reduces the odds of something happening, like jumping onto a different similar spot. And we track through the shot. Eventually it reaches the edge and SynthEyes turns it off automatically. You see the little stoplight there is changed from green to yellow. And it's always worth taking a look at that transition right as that happens. Often there could be a frame or two where the pattern's half on and half off, something like that. So you might need to actually turn that enable off a little bit earlier. Once you've done the tracking of any particular tracker, you always want to be sure to lock it up. That tells SynthEyes not to do any more tracking on that. Just locks it, prevents it from further inadvertent changes you might do just clicking on it by mistake and moving it. So it just locks it up, and that way SynthEyes, if you've got 30 or 40 trackers, you don't want to be retracking all the ones that you've already done while you're working on a new one. So that's a worthwhile thing that you always want to do when you're done with a particular tracker. Okay, so now we're ready to look at things in some more detail. I'm going to initially start out just by switching to a cameras and graphs mode, where we'll be able to look at some of the details of what's happening. So I'm just going to simplify this view. I'm going to right click this toolbox. So we drop that other timeline out. So now let's go back to the beginning. We're going to take a brick sitting on the wall there, and we'll create a tracker on that. And I'll just adjust that pattern a little. And let's start going through the shot. I'm using the middle mouse wheel. And as I do that, if you look at the edge of this brick here, you'll see that it's shifting further and further out as I move through the pattern, or through the shot. And that's because all the rest of the pattern is changing around as I'm doing that. So I'm not really staying on right exactly where I want to be, which is kind of like that corner of that brick. And I can zoom over there too. So what do we want to do? Well, as you move through the shot, you want to be repositioning that pattern to stay in the right spot. So periodically as I go through, I want to adjust that some. I'll point out there are a bunch of different ways to do the adjustment. Here I'm dragging in the mini tracker view. Of course I can go and drag the tracker itself around in the main camera view. You notice I just was dragging it and then I just right clicked and that cancels the move. I have a couple of other options as well. If I hold down the control as I drag, I'll just drag around and then I'll hold the control down. You see that gives you a fine positioning move. Similarly on the keyboard, the number pads have little arrows to them. At least on some keyboards that's like the 4, 6, 2, and 8. So those are my nudges, so I can nudge things around using the keyboard. And similarly, if I hold down control, I can nudge in even smaller increments. So as I said before, you can run the whole show just from the keyboard, and using both hands you can get a whole lot of stuff done without the mouse really at all and without having to switch back and forth. So you can go through and set these keys by hand, but as in much of SynthEyes, there are strange and wonderful ways that help automate these processes. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to this Now button. And I'll show you first what the Now button does. Is that just sets a key at the current location of the tracker. So if I was happy with my location as I went through, I can just key it at that particular point in time. And you can do that not only with this Now button, but also by right-clicking in the mini tracker view. That also removes the key. Here I'm just right-clicking successively. And of course there's an accelerator, which is just the K key. So there are a bunch of different ways to do that. Now actually what I was going to do now though, is I'm going to go to that Now button, and as you see from the tooltip, and I encourage people to look at the tooltips, there's so much information there. I'm just going to shift and right click, and that just takes out the downstream keys and tracking so that I can show what I want to do instead. And that is that I'm going to go and adjust this key every setting until that I want to have a key every 12 frames. And you see it actually created one as we were going along, so I'm just going to take that one out. So now I can start tracking through the shot, and it's automatically laying down a key. Now that'll automatically adapt it to the position, adapt to changes in the pattern as long as they're relatively small. Lighting changes, for example, and help keep it on track. If there's some larger scale things going on, then there can still be drift in it. So what the workflow is that's kind of nice, here I'm using the A and the F keys, which are the accelerators for the forward to key and backward to key buttons. So I can just move through each of these different keys, and now I can just nudge it a little. And so I can position my keys. And actually it would have been clever to do this as I went through initially, so that each time I set a key, I would be able to adjust it. And we'll take them out here. And in fact, there's a mode to do that which is stop on auto key. So in stop on auto key mode, now I'm just going to hit the play. In this case, I just used the space bar. And now it's going to run through stop at that key. So I'm just running through a bunch of frames at a time. And I can go and adjust. I can go through and you see that using that A and the F gives you a nice way to make sure that you're really staying on track there and you're fully consistent in all how you've set these different keys. Now, one of the things that happens as a result of this process is that, you know, when I'm moving keys around, the previous frames, you know, it winds up creating a little discontinuity when I just suddenly go and grab a key and move it around if the pattern has been changing over time in the intervening time. And you can see those spots here in the graph editor where there's a little bump at each of those changes. And that's because, you know, literally I changed the pattern there. So really what we need to be doing is smoothing those transitions somehow. And in fact, there's a control for that too. And when you do that, that's saying how many frames you want to do the smoothing over. And now if I just go back a bit, you see that it's smoothing them when they're being retracked. As I pointed out before, nothing happens when you go in the backwards direction. When I track forward, this is when the work happens. So there I've done smoothing over just the 5 frames. Of course, I can go and bring it all the way up. You'll see again, nothing's happening in that direction. And now here in the forwards direction, now everything is being smoothed out. Basically, it's tracking in both directions using both the following and the preceding patterns so that you get as smooth of a track as possible. You see these error curves have these nice little symmetric humps to them, and you have velocity curves that are nice and smooth. I should open this up so you can see what's what. This figure of merit curve is reflecting how much difference there is between the pattern that you're looking for and the pattern that you actually find. So that's what the key smoothing is about. It lets you get these nice smooth curves. One thing I will point out is that sometimes people do get in trouble when they have these settings very high, depending on the speed of your processor. If I'm keying every 30 frames, I had the key smooth set at 30, say, that it's actually doing not only 30 frames of tracking each time, because if I change a key here, it has to retrack all the keys before, all the frames before, as well as all the frames after. And each one of those frames is getting tracked in both directions, basically. So you wind up with the setting of 30, you're doing like 120 different individual tracks. So you can wind up with that being a very time-consuming process, and the interactive response suffers. So obviously that's just a parameter setting issue, and you either want to use a smaller value for the key smoothing, or you can actually go and turn off the smooth after keying option here as well, and then just do it all as a single pass playing through the shot at the end. So, you know, there's a control for everything, if you like. You know, there are a lot of different settings here to take advantage of. It's not our job to necessarily magically, you know, do exactly the right thing for your particular circumstance. That's just not possible. We give you the controls so The key is to know what the issues are, what's happening to you, and then have some idea of what you need to adjust to be able to get the right thing to happen. So now we want to keep on moving through the shot. And as we do that, we can adjust the size and the search size as necessary. You can do that either dragging out here or over in the control panels. So you just want to keep an eye on that. That's especially the case with shots where the camera is moving into traveling down a road, say, and things are flying by to the sides. That those you need to animate the size of the search region and the size of the feature itself. One point to that is that when you are animating the size of the tracker itself, you need to be sure that you are setting keys periodically in the position, because the size is really only effective at the changes at those position keys. So it's always comparing, the size on the current frame to the size at the last key. So if if the last key is a long distance away, it'll be a much different size, and that's bad. So you want to make sure that you're keying it often enough so that the size hasn't changed too much in the intervening time. So, another thing here, sometimes people have trouble. You say, well, I want to remove this key here. I can't do that. I can try it no matter what, but what's going on? Well, it's being removed, but with the auto keying on here, it's being added right back. So if you want to go and actually have no key at that location, you need to set one at a different spot, and now you can get rid of that key. Now then you're going to get a different key at some other place. So it's just a little gotcha that people run into from time to time. So now let's take the rest of this stuff out, because what's coming up next, that's another shift in the right click. All of a sudden we run into this tree that we previously tracked. It comes slamming into here, and we get some spurious location. So what can we do? Well, we'll just turn off the enable. So now we're saying, hey, we really don't know where that little brick is in that intervening time, because you really don't. And that's the right answer. We don't know. So now when we do know again, we have a couple different options. We can just turn that back on, and as you see here, it was continuing to predict where the feature was going to be. So when I turn the enable back on, it finds it again. Life is good, and we can carry on. It may often be a good idea, by the way, to set a new key there, just in case the pattern has changed substantially in that time. So that's one of our options. And I'll point out we can get that enable turned back on by using an E key on the keyboard. The other thing we can just do is start dragging in that mini tracker view, and that will turn on the enable and start positioning the tracker. And that can be an easy thing to do if things are moving around, so that just turning the E on, turning the enable back on isn't working. Just starting to drag can be a quick and easy way to reposition things. And the other way to do this is using a feature called Z drop, where I'm going to hold down the Z key. I'm just going to go out to where I want the feature to be and click. And that just is going to put it there. So if the feature's been really missing for quite some time, rather than going and trying to drag across the countryside to get to the right location, you can just use that Z drop feature and place the tracker right exactly where you want it in the first place. And I'll point out there's a mode to lock, basically lock the Z key on, so that you don't have to be holding the Z key down a whole lot. And that's especially good sometimes if you're handling surveyed shots. So after our when our feature disappears, we turn it off, then we turn it back on, and now we can keep on moving through the shot, and see that may happen fairly often depending on what we've got. So we'll try it here. And you can look carefully and decide, oh, do I really know where this is well enough or not? Here we may actually be able to slide by even though it's partly obscured. And then one of the things that you notice, I'm repositioning the tracker to stay in the limited view. And I'll point out, generally you're going to have a bigger screen than what we can do with this capture window for making this tutorial. So normally there's some more room for seeing stuff. But if I hold it, if I put on hit the 5 key, which is a pan to follow mode, then the tracker is going to automatically stay centered in this view. So that can just save some trouble. So maybe I want to turn it off here, turn it back on there. So you can see you can just move through this relatively quickly. And you're saying the right thing, and this is the right thing to say, is that I don't know what happened in this period of time. Now, sometimes that's not going to be good enough, and that the particular case for that is one where there are very few trackers available on the scene. That's typically an object track where the object isn't that big. There just aren't that many features to track. You can get into a situation where you really want to have some kind of data to fill in the gaps where you can't see it. So there are bunches of different ways to do that. One way is I could just guess, and I could physically position the tracker into different locations in there and just say, oh, it must be there. And you can look at the graph editor and try and kludge that together. Not really the super bestest way. There's another way to do that, which is to use this tool called Finalize Trackers, the hammer tool, which actually has some gap filling tools to it that will let it go, and it'll just kind of fill in some of those gaps. And again, that can be a stopgap sort of mechanism. And that'll work, as long as the shot is relatively smooth. If it's a handheld shot, it can be very much more difficult to do that because you're contending not only with the motion of the thing that you're tracking, but the fact that the camera is bouncing up and down. And one other aspect to this I wanted to point out where you might want to fill in these gaps is if you have a shot with a lot of lens distortion to it, and that can create an issue whenever a tracker appears or disappears. Basically, there a whole lot of new information is appearing or being removed, and that can cause pops in the final solve due to the coming and going, and the fact that all of a sudden, at one point in time you're pulling the solution in a different direction, and then all of a sudden you're not, so the solution jumps a little bit. So that can be a reason to go and fill these gaps as well. Of course, it's always better to eliminate the lens distortion. The solver does have a smoothing, blending function on these occurrences also that it reduces the weight right at the ends of those tails, and there's a transition frames control on the solver panel also that you can adjust. But these are various kinds of stopgap measures. So I'll show you another kind of stopgap measure, if you like, which is what if we just track something else nearby in the meantime. So what we want to do is look for something that's visible at both the beginning and end of the occluded section. Where we can see what we're tracking and see the thing that we want to use instead. This is a little complicated here just because there's another tree coming along behind it. So we can take something up here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to this last frame where the pattern is visible and our new feature is visible. We're going to turn on the tracker offset. Now the offset channel, and there's two of them, a horizontal and vertical offset, and they appear in our graph editor now for us to watch too. They're going to just get added onto the position of whatever it is that we're tracking to determine the final tracker location. So the game that we're going to do is we're going to track something else, but we're going to add an offset that means that the final tracker location is what we want. So to get all this stuff set up, we're just going to hold down the Shift key, and we're going to drag our tracker over to our new feature that we want to track. So let's just pick something up there. And I'll point out I can do that shift drag in the camera view, in the mini tracker view, or in the simultrack window as well. So once I've done that, you know, it's set a key for the position of the tracker over there, and it's also set up keys on the offset channels as well. We'll just get those positioned. So now I can start moving through the shot again. SynthEyes is tracking that new feature instead. And you can see there's an offset marker sitting out there where the final tracker location is. So I'm going to roll through the shot till I reach my new location. Now you see the field of view, you know, the relative positioning of the camera has changed a little during that time. So our offset position is no longer super accurately on the spot that we want to be at. So I'm going to go and I'm going to move that now. You'll notice that we're in the 5 mode, so it's still saying centered on that position. And you'll see in the graph editor that we've now animated those offset channels. And they're animated in such a way that at the beginning of the shot, it's at the right offset. And at the end of the little occluded interval, it's also at the right spot. So in between, you know, it's linearly interpolating that offset. So we're getting a reasonably good estimate of where that feature is, even though it's being blocked in the middle. Now here it's a relatively smooth shot, but the same thing works even if the whole shot is bouncing up and down and everything. We can still get, you know, a reasonable estimate of where things are because it's all kind of happening relatively. So now that we've tweaked up our final offset values, now we just turn that offset channel back off, and now the tracker is jumped back to there. Or you see that the offset channel is animated as well. And now we can just keep on tracking normally. Of course, then we run into another tree comes whipping by. So now we can actually do the same thing. But here, unfortunately, you know, our initial feature is still being blocked by that first tree. So we need to pick something else. There's something back up there, plenty of stuff that we can use on the other side. So again, I'm just going to hold down the shift key. I'll just drag over to this piece of trash, whatever that is over there. You'll see that our offset values have gotten animated up some more. And now we can keep on tracking until we get our feature visible again. And again, we're going to go and just tune that back up a little and then turn the offset back off. Now again, we can keep on tracking. Notice as we keep on going, we're still getting new keys being set. Here comes the next tree. So we'll do the same thing. Again, we get something else. Here we can use our same thing, but everything's shifted around a little by that point. Now we've made it through the shot. Now one thing you might notice is that we've got this peaky effect here still, because as we were tracking forward, there weren't the existing keys already. So we have the little jumps still are there. So the thing that we go back and do now is just run back to the beginning of that section. Now we'll go through and let it play through and have it retract, taking advantage of both the forwards and backwards keys to be able to smoothly blend the two patterns together and get as smooth as possible of a track. So now we have a complete track that runs through this entire shot. We'll lock it up. Now we can go and scrub through the entire shot. One thing I wanted to show is that when the tracker is unlocked, it is showing the feature that is being tracked in the mini tracker view. Well, once you lock the tracker up, then it is just showing the final position the entire way through. So it's just a slightly different behavior that makes it a little clearer later where the trackers are going that are being fed to the solver. So, after you have tracked something, you do want to go through, scrub through it, take a look at it, make sure that the tracking is suitable, is accurate all the way through. You can use your A and your F keys to flip through and look at these different keys, adjust things as necessary. Now here we've been doing everything tracking in the forward direction. I'll point out that we can do the same thing in reverse. You could go to the end of the shot. You could just pick something out, create a tracker out here. Notice I still have that 5 mode on, pan to follow. And I'll change the direction to go backwards. Notice the main play direction has changed also. Now I can start tracking in the reverse direction as well. So all the stuff that we've done in the forward direction works in the reverse direction as well. And that is helpful in some sorts of shots where you want to track something that at the end of the shot it's clearly visible, but at the beginning of the shot it's not. And that's a shot where you're driving down a road, something that's in the distance, you're going to be able to see it clearly at the end of the shot, but not so much at the beginning. So it's actually easier to start at the end of the shot and track back towards the beginning. few other little things. There are also a variety of modes for how your trackers should look. That are tracker appearance modes. We can turn on or off then whether names are shown, whether they're shown just as dots, and so on. So there are a whole lot of different options available also. So I invite you to investigate those as well. So there's a lot more stuff. There are a lot more tutorials. There are a lot more stuff in the manual. You can find the accelerator keys for a lot of this stuff. If you go and you look at the keyboard map and hit this listing button, you'll see that you get a nice little listing of all the stuff that's indexed a couple different ways. That'll help you learn what the different accelerator keys are so that you can really just sit and basically type and run through your supervised tracking and really be able to get some remarkably accurate tracks that way. So thanks. Hope you enjoyed the show.